Thank you, Will. So NIS2 and the CRA, the Cyber Resilience Act, is part of a whole suite of EU legislation in the field of security. And when you start scratching the surface, there's actually loads of this legislation. So CRA, the Cyber Resilience Act, is product cybersecurity, so hardware and software, which is going to be connected to a device or a network. But you also have something called DORA. There's actually two instruments there, a directive and a regulation, which is to financial services and ICT providers in the financial sector. What NIS2 is to a whole bunch of wider sectors, so cyber for the financial sector. You have something called the Cybersecurity Act, which has already been enforced for some time, since 2019, but it's going to be amended. And managed security services are going to come into the scope of that at some point in the next year or two. And then you have something which is not cyber at all, but it will overlap and capture a lot of the entities who are caught by NIS2, something called someone needs to look at the catchiness of these, the Resilience of Critical Entities Directive. That's in the EU. In the UK, we are going much more light touch. And we're of course not legally obliged to do it. We're no longer part of the European Union, so we don't need to do a NIS2, but we're not going to do one anyway. We're going much lighter touch. More about that in a minute. But even we have some legislation. So this one, I'm going to have to read it. It's that catchy. The Product Security and Telecommunications Infrastructure Security Requirements for Relevant Connectable Products Regulations 2023. When this much legislation overlaps, you need a Venn diagram. I got distracted. You can see a bit of silliness. The reference is fun to laugh at, other than the obvious, it does have a serious point. This is actually part of the quite strong criticism from the open source community about one of the instruments I mentioned, the Cyber Resilience Act, where they said this is going to chill or even kill innovation in the sector. It doesn't recognize how we develop software in that sector. And the EU institutions back down. I don't think we've solved it, but there is an open source gateway, so-called, in that legislation. The rest of it is silly. Okay, but let's have a look at scope. So on the left, you can see, so NIS1, a relatively small number of sectors covered by the first Network and Information Systems Security Directive. And it's not even all of them, because what's actually on the slide is the UK implementation of the first NIS directive. So if you're looking closely, you'll see it doesn't include financial services, because in the UK, what we said was we have at least equivalent requirements in other legislation, namely FISMA and some other financial services type legislation. So we don't need to enact something in the NIS regulations to deal with that sector. That's broadly the gist of it. That same saving appears in NIS2 now. What you have on the right-hand side is all the sectors nearly doubling under NIS2. And we've changed the terminology from operators of essential services to essential and important sectors. And there's a simple, at least to describe, size cap rule, which determines scope and whether you're in or out. But scope is a whole topic in its own right, which there's no way you can cover in 10 minutes or so. But essentially, if you're a medium-sized enterprise in one of those sectors, then you're caught. And there are confusingly different definitions depending on which sector you're talking about for what constitutes medium-sized. And then if you're smaller than that, but you're societally important, then you're caught as well. Let me make a play for something you don't see very much about in the commentary about NIS2 or the CRA. A lot of that commentary, understandably, is about, well, what are my obligations going to be if I'm one of the regulated entities, either an essential entity or an important entity, caught by the rules. Not very much is said about the fact that about half, if not more, NIS2 is really aimed at the member states themselves. And I think unless you dwell on that context a bit, something will escape you about the far-reaching nature of this instrument in cybersecurity. It is a very far-reaching, in my view, philosophy about the importance of sharing information, sharing best practices, and otherwise disseminating information quite publicly. So you have 3 chapters, a whole chapter devoted to coordinated cybersecurity frameworks, which is all about setting up or developing the role of each of the bodies that will regulate regulated entities. Cooperation at union and international level kind of speaks for itself, and information sharing. So just to give you an idea of what is being talked about, vulnerability disclosure. That's nothing new. We've had that forever. The idea that you will disclose a vulnerability in a networks or information system or a product under the CRA, so that once a patch is available, there's widespread knowledge and people get on with patching their systems or network or whatever the issue is. There is going to be a whole mechanism for coordinated vulnerability disclosure under NIS2. And that means that entities which are not in scope of it can voluntarily report. NIS2, which is the European Cybersecurity Agency, is tasked with setting up a database in order to capture those. And stakeholders, TBD exactly who that means, in due course will be able to access that. And that's a bit controversial, because are we talking about vulnerability? It's coordinated vulnerability disclosure. So it's one assumes after the patch has actually been found and released, because otherwise vendors would have a problem with that. That's all a bit up in the air, but it gives you an idea about the kind of philosophical approach of the legislation. There's my bid to be in this topic, to be in next year's top 10, or even go up. That was really dodgy, wasn't it? And so I just think that's worth keeping in mind as you think about the things that most of us are more focused on. So the duty of care under NIS2 is not essentially different from what it was under NIS1. That NIS1 was all about appropriate and proportionate cybersecurity measures. It's language that we're all familiar with, GDPR. It's very similar language. We can get behind that. It doesn't essentially change under NIS2. There's just way more of it. So there are, in fact, a minimum 10 measures. I've only even put up 6 on the slide. And I'll just pick out one of those, because what it does, supply chain security, brings into scope indirectly a whole load of organizations that might not think that they're in scope. So I mean, supply chains are, sometimes very large players in them, but of course also lots of SMEs. And I don't think it's controversial to say that, of course, we have seen for years and years that poor security practices and quite major incidents, often when you trace them back to their root cause, there's someone in the supply chain with quite poor security practices. So there's now a mandated flow down of supply chain security that is needed by regulated entities under the duties of care in NIS2. How does supervision and enforcement work? And then I just want to do one more or 2 more slides. So the only a couple of important differences to grasp between essential entities and important entities. Essential entities get what's called proactive supervision. So it's in advance of, heaven forbid, any incident at all. But they are supervised by any number of different measures, which can be at any time. If you're an important entity, it's after the event, so after the incident. The fines are slightly different between the 2 regimes, but I think the bit that's much more interesting than that, and it's on the right-hand side, is actually the power temporarily to suspend senior management if, after an incident has taken place and that entity has been ordered to put in place more effective cybersecurity measures, if they are deemed ineffective, the competent authority can reach into the organisation and issue a temporary suspension notice against actual individuals in the organisation. I think that's quite interesting, and there will be lots of guidance, I'm sure, about that. Okay, I'm not going to say much about this because this is getting into the weeds, but anyone who's ever been involved in one of these incidents will. So this is a somewhat new 3-stage reporting process, but a month from start to finish to final report is quite punchy. And again, I think that it's going to be subject to quite a lot of guidance because I'm not sure how that works. Okay, let me wrap it up with are member states ready and what is the UK doing? I think there should be some text which reveals these numbers add up to the member states of the European Union, and one bit of text says no draft laws published yet. Another one says draft law published but hasn't been debated by Parliament, and the other one says national transposition has actually taken place. Keep in mind that we've got about 5 months to go. 17th of October is when the NIS2 comes into effect. The only other thing to say is, what is the UK doing? We're outside of all of these information sharing mechanisms. We aren't going to do NIS2. We're going to do some limited amendments to the NIS regulations that we have at the moment. So there's actually an interesting, genuine opportunity to see 2 quite different approaches to cybersecurity, whether this one is actually going to deliver better security. We shall have to wait and see. Time will tell. Thank you. Over to Anna.